The Empire of Kush was born along the banks of the Nile, in the region that today corresponds to northern Sudan, and that in the ancient world was called Nubia. Its roots stretch back to the 3rd millennium BC, when along the 4th cataract of the Nile, there flourished an indigenous culture that the Egyptians called Taseti, the land of the bow, a reference to the extraordinary skill of Nubian archers who would accompany the pharaohs on their military campaigns for centuries. The first organized kingdom emerged around 2500 BC in the region of Kerma, where a city of considerable size became the center of a political and commercial power capable of competing with Egypt itself. Kerma was discovered and excavated for the first time by the American archaeologist George Reisner in the early 20th century, and then taken up again by Swiss missions led by Charles Bonnet from the 1960s onward, with campaigns that continue to this day. The excavations at Kerma revealed an urban center with monumental structures, among them the Western Dafufa, a large mud brick building still standing over 17 meters high today, probably a temple or a palace, and thousands of tombs displaying funerary rituals of extraordinary complexity, with animal and human sacrifices on a massive scale. Between 2003 and 2020, the archaeologists of the Swiss mission found at Kerma over 250 black granite statues, depicting Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle and New Kingdom, many of them in excellent condition, which had probably been transported there as war spoils or as tribute, a discovery that profoundly reshaped the understanding of relations between Egypt and Nubia in that era. The kingdom of Kerma was conquered by Egypt around 1500 BC, during the reign of Thutmose I, who pushed the Egyptian borders as far as the 4th cataract. For almost 5 centuries, Nubia was an Egyptian province, absorbing the language, religion, architecture, and culture of its conquerors. Paradoxically, this assimilation was so thorough that when Egyptian power declined, it was the Nubians who preserved and transmitted that tradition with greater fidelity than the Egyptians themselves. Around 850 BC, a new political power emerged in the region of Napata, at the foot of the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal, and took the name of the kingdom of Kush. Gebel Barkal was considered the dwelling of the god Amun, and its natural shape, a rock resembling the double crown of Egypt, held extraordinary symbolic value for the legitimization of royal power. The Kushite kings presented themselves as the true heirs of the pharaonic tradition, more authentic than the Egyptians themselves, who had been corrupted by the foreign influence of the Libyans, who then dominated the Nile Delta. With King Kashta and then his son Pianki, also known as Pa, the kingdom of Kush accomplished the most extraordinary feat in its history, the conquest of Egypt. Pa marched northward around 728 BC, defeated the Libyan princes who dominated the country, and was crowned pharaoh of Egypt, giving rise to the 25th dynasty, the one historians call the Black Dynasty, or the Nubian dynasty. The victory still of Pa, a granite monolith nearly 2 meters tall discovered at Napata in 1862, and today housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the most important historical documents of African antiquity. It records in hieroglyphics the detailed account of the military campaign, with the names of the conquered cities, the terms of surrender, and prayers of thanksgiving to Amun. Pa's successor, Shabaka, consolidated rule over all of Egypt and moved the capital to Memphis. The Kushite kings built temples, restored ancient monuments, and had themselves portrayed wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, exactly as the pharaohs of earlier eras had done. Their reign brought about a cultural renaissance known to scholars as the Sate Renaissance, characterized by a deliberate return to the artistic and religious models of the Old and Middle Kingdom of Egypt. Kushite rule over Egypt lasted around 70 years. It was interrupted by the Assyrian invasion. Esarhaddon conquered Memphis in 671 BC, and his son Ashurbanipal drove the Kushites definitively out of Egypt after the devastating sack of Thebes in 663 BC. The kings of Kush retreated to Napata and then, around 590 BC, moved the capital further south to Meroe, a city located between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, in a region richer in rainfall, timber, and iron. This decision marked the beginning of a new and in some ways even more flourishing period. The Meroitic Kingdom, which lasted from the 8th century BC to the 4th century AD, that is for over 1,000 years. Meroe became one of the most important cities of ancient Africa, the center of an original civilization that synthesized Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and sub-Saharan African influences into a wholly distinctive culture. The city was famous for its ironworking. Its foundries produced enormous quantities of metal that were exported throughout Africa and the Mediterranean. In its surroundings, there still stand today over 200 pyramids, smaller and steeper than the Egyptian ones, which served as tombs for Meroitic kings and queens. The pyramids of Meroe, whose ruins rise from the desert of northern Sudan, were unfortunately severely damaged in the 19th century by the Italian adventurer Giuseppe Ferlini, who systematically dismantled them in search of treasure, destroying structures thousands of years old in the name of archaeological plunder. One of the most fascinating and still partially mysterious features of the Meroitic Kingdom is its writing system. The Kushites first developed a writing system based on Egyptian hieroglyphics to write the Meroitic language, then created an original alphabet of 23 symbols in both hieroglyphic and cursive form. The Meroitic script was deciphered in its phonetic structure by the Briton Francis Llewellyn Griffith in 1909, but the language it represents remains largely incomprehensible to this day. We know how the words are pronounced, but we do not understand their meaning, a linguistic paradox that makes Meroitic one of the great open challenges of archaeology and linguistics worldwide. Over the past decade, several international projects, including one coordinated by the French University of Lille with Italian and German contributions, have been attempting to decipher the language through computational analysis of all known Meroitic texts, around 1,000 inscriptions, comparing them with modern Nilo-Saharan languages in the hope of finding grammatical or lexical correspondences. The Kingdom of Kush was governed by a divine monarchy in which women held an extraordinarily important role. The queens of Meroe, called Kandake, a term from which the given name Candace in Western languages derives, were rulers in their own right, not merely consorts. Some of them reigned independently and personally led armies into battle. The Kandake Amanirenas is remembered for having waged a victorious war against Rome between 27 and 22 BC, forcing Augustus to negotiate peace terms favorable to the Kushites, despite Rome's overwhelming military superiority. The bronze head of Augustus, found buried beneath the threshold of a temple at Meroe, today housed in the British Museum, is interpreted as a war trophy deliberately trampled upon by visitors, an act of symbolic defiance toward the power of Rome. This statue was discovered in 1910 during excavations by John Garstang for the University of Liverpool, and remains one of the most evocative objects in the whole of Sudanese archaeology. The Meroitic Kingdom declined progressively between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD for reasons still debated among scholars. The gradual depletion of the forest resources needed by the iron foundries, the growing pressure of the Blemmyes and Noba nomads on its borders, and the shifting of trade routes with the rise of the Kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. It was Aksum that delivered the final blow. Around 350 AD, the Aksumite king Ezana invaded Meroe and brought the last chapter of the Kingdom of Kush to an end. The trilingual inscriptions of Izana, written in Ge'ez, Greek, and South Arabian, commemorate the victory and are a precious historical source for the end of this civilization. The modern rediscovery of the kingdom of Kush is relatively recent and still largely incomplete. For centuries, the history of ancient Africa had been considered a history without written documents, deliberately ignoring the Kushite and Meroitic evidence. It was only with Reisner's excavations at the beginning of the 20th century that academic attention began to shift toward Sudan. In recent decades, international missions have multiplied. The Italian archaeological mission of the University of Bologna, led by Maurizio Salvini and later by other scholars, has worked on sites in northern Sudan, contributing to epigraphic documentation. The Polish mission of the University of Warsaw has conducted important excavations at Dongola, the ancient Tungal, capital of the medieval Christian kingdom of Makuria, that arose on the ruins of Kushite civilization. In 2020, the Polish mission at Dongola was nominated for the International Archaeological Discovery Award for the extraordinary finds made in the palace complex of the city. New technologies are revolutionizing knowledge of ancient Sudan. Satellite remote sensing has made it possible to identify hundreds of archaeological sites never before explored beneath the sands of the Nubian desert. The EMANA project, an international initiative funded by the Getty Foundation, has cataloged thousands of at-risk sites across northern Africa, many of them in Sudan, creating a fundamental digital archive for their protection. Ancient DNA analyses conducted on mummies and skeletons found in Nubian cemeteries and published between 2017 and 2022 in journals such as Nature and Current Biology revealed that the populations of ancient Kush had a mixed genetic composition, with sub-Saharan African, North African, and Middle Eastern components in proportions that varied across the ages, confirming the role of cultural and biological crossroads that Nubia has always played in the history of the African continent. Isotopic studies conducted on the teeth of individuals buried in the royal cemeteries of Kerma and Meroe demonstrated the presence of people who had grown up in geographically distant regions, bearing witness to the mobility of people and goods in this part of the world far earlier than had been imagined. Present-day Sudan holds one of the richest and least studied archaeological heritages in the world. The pyramids of Meroe, the site of Napata at Gebel Barkal, the ruins of Kerma, the temples of Musawarat es Sufra, with their extraordinary bas-reliefs depicting elephants, the remains of the city of Naka, with its lion temple of the god Aptimak. All of this constitutes a cultural universe of extraordinary importance that the international community still knows far too little about. Unfortunately, the civil war that broke out in Sudan in 2023 has placed this heritage in grave danger, interrupting archaeological missions, exposing sites to looting, and making any work of documentation and conservation in the field impossible. The international scientific community is watching with deep concern what is happening, aware that every day of conflict represents an irreparable loss for the memory of all humanity.